Part 3, a little closer. Early summer 1937, Gary, Indiana. The Mighty Miss Malone, Chapter 33, The Quest for Jonah Blackbeard. We got a taxi cab at the Gary bus station and told the driver the address. He stopped in front of a beautiful little house with a porch and a green door. I have never been so excited in my life. We were dumbstruck. Deza, are you sure this is the right address? Yes, Mother, this is it. Let's see if the key fits. We left our bundles on the sidewalk and went up the walkway like a couple of thieves waiting for someone to shout, "Hey, get off that porch!" But no one did. My hands were shaking too much to get to the key into the lock. Mother took it from me, stuck it in, held her breath, and turned it to the left. Nothing. She turned it to the right. The lock clicked and Mother pulled the door open. We walked in and I yelled, "Hello?" The word echoed around the empty rooms. Mother said, "Deza, we're home." We hugged each other before I started running through the house. I knew how the little girl, Rosario, and her family felt when they first looked through our old house. Every room was so beautiful that it might as well have been filled with gold nuggets. We didn't have any furniture, but we were used to sleeping on the ground, so spreading sheets and blankets on the bedroom floor didn't feel all that bad. With the mother Father was going to send, it wouldn't be long before we'd have beds and tables and chairs, and maybe even a new wardrobe of our own. I pulled my blanket up to my chin and said, "Mother, isn't it wonderful? We're back in Gary. Father kept his word." Mother sighed. "Darling daughter Deza, it's been a long day and tomorrow's going to be another. I've got to find work. I'll look up Mrs. Henderson and the Rhymeses, and I know you've got some searches of your own to do. As much as I'd love to chat with you right now, button that lip and let's get some sleep." She smiled and leaned over to kiss my forehead. Kisses, kisses, kisses make you stronger. Jimmy was right. If you're getting a bandage ripped off, it's best to do it in one quick snatch. Same way with getting bad news. Find out and get it over with. Or as Father would say, "Deza, my darling daughter, don't dilly-dally." On our first full day in our new house, I decided to get two pieces of very bad news out of the way. Mrs. Needham's house was empty, and as I walked to Clarice's house, my stomach started folding up in a couple of blocks off. I was pretty sure they wouldn't be there, but I had to try. I stood in front of her house and knew right away. When a house has 12 boys and one girl living in it, it's different than an empty house, even if they've all gone to the park or for a walk. Clarice's house looked the same, but I knew right away something was wrong. It reminded me of the spot in my gums where Doc had pulled my tooth. Even though you couldn't tell it from the outside, something big and important was gone, forever after. Maybe that's what I felt. Or maybe it was me knowing I'd have to go through the rest of my life with half a heart. But this second piece of bad news made me want to leave without even asking her neighbors if they knew anything. I'd waited until the next day to see if Dr. Bracy, being gone, was the third piece of bad news. Instead, I went to the library to find out if I could still use my card. Mrs. Ashton remembered me and was very pleased things had turned out so good for us. Even though I didn't have a card with my new address yet, she let me check out 4 books. I was reading and walking and got right up to our new front porch before I noticed there was a taxi cab sitting in front of our home. Jimmy? Father? I fumbled for my key and ran onto the porch. Mother called from inside the taxicab. "Deza!" She sounded very nervous. I froze. "Well, kiddo, here's part 3 of your bad news." I ran to the taxicab. "Mother, what's wrong?" "Get in." I climbed in next to her. "What? What happened?" "I got a letter from a place in Lansing, Michigan. There's a man who's been in a poorhouse there for the last year. We have to check, Deza." "Check what?" "There's a chance the man may be your father." "What?" "Lower your voice, Deza." "Mother, what are you talking about? A man in a poorhouse? How could it be father? Father's been traveling all around the country and sending us—" A million more questions bounced around in my skull, but Mother said, "Deza, think it through. If those letters were from your father, why didn't they ever mention Jimmy?" I'd thought about that. And how does a carpenter make a living with a hand so badly injured he can't hold a pen? But and besides, Miss Malone, who on earth has ever heard of something called a traveling carpenter? Well, there wasn't one bit of your father in those letters. It's just like that letter to Mrs. Carsdale's friend in Flint. Why do you think I never used it? You didn't? Mother said Jimmy opened it for me, and once I read it, I saw the letter was pure Deza Malone, not Mrs. Carsdale. Mother is so smart. You and I know Roscoe Malone. We know him. We both know that wasn't his writing in those letters. No, it had to. She gently squeezed my cheek. You knew, Deza. You wanted so desperately for them to be from your father that you couldn't admit they weren't. But you knew. But why didn't he write to us? Father would never have let us worry so long. And who wrote? Something must have happened, Deza. Something terrible. She looked out the window. I thought about bringing Mrs. Kenworthy. I couldn't do this alone. But you've grown so much lately, and there's no one else who understands this like you, Deza. No one. Mother was right. I felt so proud that I could really do something to help. Mother said to the taxi driver, $10 flat, right? Round trip? We started driving back to Michigan. If hospitals looked that horrible, if hospitals took that horrible smell they have, bottled it up, and mailed it away, this poorhouse in Lansing, Michigan, must have been where the postman had been delivering the bottles. Mother is much more used to bad odors than I am, and as we stepped onto the porch, even she took a surprised quick breath. My hand flew up and pinched my nose shut. She said, "Breathe out your mouth, Deza. We can't be rude." She took a letter out of her purse and knocked on the front door. After her second knock, a man in a white uniform answered. Yes? Hello, I've been writing to a Mr. Jackson. He said there's a possibility my husband is here. I'm Mr. Jackson. Fine. I'd like to get some information on the man you called Jonah Blackbeard. Oh, yes, you're the lady who wrote looking for her husband. But, ma'am, I told you I don't think Jonah is him. You said your husband was a carpenter. We don't know much about old Jonah, but we're pretty sure he was a sailor or in the merchant marine. Mr. Jackson, I have absolutely no clues where my husband is. I'd like to see this Jonah Blackbird. The things you wrote about him made me wonder. Come to the office. Let me get his file. I'm sorry, but I think this is wasting your time. Mother grabbed my wrist and was walking into the house. Breathing out of your mouth was worthless once you got inside. The smell was like a living animal. It clawed at your nostrils and rubbed against your legs like a over-friendly cat. Rotten meat and leaking toilets and perspiration were bad enough. But what made it worse was it seemed like someone had sloshed a bucket full of strong cleaning fluid all over everything to fight the bad odor. My eyes watered as I kept breathing out of my mouth. In his office, Mr. Jackson opened a drawer that was choked with files. After thumbing through them, he took one out. There was a piece of paper in it. It says some hobo brought him into the colored hospital in Lansing. He was barely conscious, trouble breathing, high fever. They thought he was going to pass, but he just kept hanging on. He read, Name unknown. Age unknown. Occupation thought to be a sailor. No next of kin, no identification. After a while, the hospital figured he'd had some kind of attack, maybe asthma. Whatever it was might have triggered a small stroke, too. He was confused, but he's shown real improvement over the months. As he talked, Mother twisted the strap of her purse. He talked so little about himself that we thought he was on the run from the law. But once you spend time with him, you'll see that's not likely. He's a smart man, but he doesn't talk much. Won't tell anyone his name. There's 5 or 6 others here with stories like his. We don't try to push them to talk about that past. If they want to talk, they do. If not, who am I to say they should? There's lots of folks who want to forget or be forgotten. He was brought here on July 17th of last year, he sighed, about a month after Joe got beat. Mother said, Where is he? Everyone's in the backyard getting some air. All 3 of us stood up. Mother said, Deza, you wait here. But, Deza. I sat back down and waited long enough for Mother to follow the man out of the room. I was right behind them. Mother went with him through a long, dark hallway toward the back of the house. She said, If this man won't say his name, why are you calling him Jonah Blackbeard? Mr. Jackson laughed. We had to call him something. He only talks about 2 things. We call him Jonah because the first thing he started talking about was getting swallowed up in the belly of a fire-breathing dragon. We call him Blackbird because he claims he fought off a ship on the ocean. Mother stopped at the back door. The man went through, and I could hear him say, Jonah, you awake? Come on, Jonah, you got visitors. Mother opened the screen door and stood on the back porch. I walked out behind her. There were 8 or 9 men in the backyard, and they looked like a collection of thrown out rag dolls. Long, skinny arms were flopped into their laps, heads hung like they had no neck bones, and legs were crossed or dangling from the arms of chairs like they were filled with sawdust. Mr. Jackson's words about Joe Louis had me thinking about that horrible fight. If anyone painted a picture about how Gary, Indiana felt after Joe Louis got beat, this backyard of poor men in Lansing, Michigan would be it. Mr. Jackson went to one of the men who had his back turned to us. He was wrapped in a yellow stained sheet so that only his head was showing. Jonah, are you all right? The man's head was slumped to the side. Jonah. Mr. Jackson looked at us and shrugged. Mother stepped off the porch. I was too afraid to follow. We walked to the man's chair. Her hand went to her mouth, and she softly asked, Roscoe? The head came up and slowly twisted to look at her. After a second, the man's bony hands covered his face. And just like Mother said, we know Roscoe Malone. It seems like if you had nearly a year to concentrate on something and wonder about it and dream and worry about it day and night, that with all that time, you'd be able to get at least part of it right if it ever came true. But not one thing I'd imagined happened. I didn't rush to Father and hug him and scold him and cry in his chest. I didn't tell him how much I missed him. I didn't gut punch him for being gone. I didn't talk or even move. Mother knelt and put her left hand out. Roscoe, sweetheart. The man brought his hands down, and his skinny arm came from under the sheet and trembled as it reached toward Mother's hand. Father said, Peg. Their shaking fingers joined together like something Mrs. Henderson had knitted. They stared at each other before Father turned Mother's hand to look at her fingers. Peg, your ring? Mother wiped her eyes and pulled the string from around her neck. Here, Roscoe, it's right here. And I could ask you the same thing. Father's claw of a hand went to his neck. He pulled out a tired string that had his wedding band on it. I knew you'd never give up on me, Peg. Never, Roscoe. Malone, never. She patted his beard. How could I give up on you? How could I give up on my whole life? Father said, You found me. How? I thought I'd never see you again. Sweetheart, Mother held her face against Father's. Do you know I've spent the last year writing to every police station and hospital, every boarding house and funeral home, and even every morgue between Gary and Flint? I know you, Roscoe. I knew if you were alive and all right, there was no way you'd not write. I knew something had gone horribly wrong. Why didn't you write, dear? Why didn't you let us know you were here? Peg, Peg, Peg. I never made it to Flint. I woke up in the hospital again. It was too much. I thought I was dying. I couldn't figure out who I was for the longest time. Once things started clearing up, I did write. The letters all came back. He put his hand back over his face. I'm so sorry. When I couldn't get in touch with you, when I thought I'd lost you and the kids, I just didn't care anymore. I'm afraid I gave up, Peg. Mother sighed. Sweetheart, you're coming home. We have a lot to talk about, Mr. Malone. Yes, we do. How are the babies? Why don't you ask her? He shifted in the chair to look at me. His hair was long and dirty and snarled, and he had a twisted beard that had bits of food in it, and his eyes burned at me. He sobbed and smiled his jack-o'-lantern smile, and he was still the handsomest man I'd ever seen. I rushed to hug him and could feel his shoulder blades poking from beneath the sheet. I fell into his open arms. The mighty Miss Malone. I could hear how hard his heart hit against his ribs. There was so much I wanted to say, but everything I had rehearsed for that moment was forgotten. The only thing I could think of, the thing I wanted to tell him most of all, was, Look, Father, Jimmy got my teeth fixed. I wanted him to know he didn't have to breathe out of his nose when he came near me. He choked and covered his mouth with his hand. Oh, sweetheart, my darling daughter Deza, I'm so happy. It's so good to see you. Father twisted to look at the house. Where's Jimmy? He's doing real good, Father. He's all grown up now. You're not going to believe. Mother snapped at Mr. Jackson. How dare you? How dare you treat any human being like this? Do you know who this man is? Mrs. Blackbeard. Look, don't be ridiculous. My name is Mrs. Malone, and this is Roscoe Malone, my husband, her father. How can you allow someone to wallow in their own filth like this? Get me some soap, a washcloth, a towel, some scissors, a razor, a toothbrush, baking soda, and Vaseline. Ma'am, we do the best we can on what we have. There's barely money to feed the men. Mother, calm down. I'm sorry, Mr. Jackson. Is there a pharmacy around here? Deza, write the list down. Mr. Jackson said, "Hold on, Mrs. Malone. I've got some of my own things you can use to clean him up." Mother said, "Thank you very much. Could you help me get him to the bathroom?" I started to help Father up, and the sheet fell away from his legs. They were nothing but bones covered in tight, ashy brown skin. Mother covered him and said, "Deza, take $1 from my purse and tell the cab driver he needs to wait another hour before we go back. Then go wait in the cab to make sure he doesn't leave." "But Mother, I want to—" "Deza?" I sat in the taxi cab. I was happy Mother had shooed me off. It would have been really hard to watch Father being led around like a baby. Plus, sitting like this gave him some time to figure some things out, like the letters. Mother was right. I think I didn't know they couldn't have been from Father, but they were real and they were there, and it was like Mother says, any port in a storm. Father never would have forgotten to put Jimmy's name on the letters. That should have been my first clue. But who would send the Malones that much money every 2 weeks? Who was that kind and that rich? Mrs. Needham? She had a wonderful heart and a good character, but she's a teacher, and teachers are poor as church mice. My heart skipped a beat. Dr. Bracy made a whole lot more sense. She was a doctor, had a telephone right in her house, and baked pies all the time. She must be very, very rich, and she had been very kind. But that didn't make sense either. How would she know to send letters to us at General Delivery in Flint? I was stumped. Then an epiphany hit me in the head as hard as Dolly Peaches had. It was Jimmy. No one else could have known where to write us. No one else could have cared enough to do it. No one else was making that much money. And most of all, no one else would have forgotten to put their own name on the letters. That was why he didn't get excited when I told him Father was okay. I cried so hard the cab driver said, "Wait, miss, don't cry." "I'll wait." I said, "I'm not crying for that. I'm crying because I have the best brother in the world, and I am so proud of him that I could bust." The door of the horrible smelling house came open, and Mother and Mr. Jackson slowly walked Father to the taxicab. I opened the back door for them. I thought he looked skinny before, but now with his hair cut short and his beard shaved off and his hideous sheet traded for a white set of clothes like Mr. Jackson's, it looked like they'd cut 30 more pounds off him. Mr. Jackson said, "Hold on, Mrs. Malone. There's something of his in the office." Me and Mother helped Father into the seat between us. He smiled, then shut his eyes and leaned his head on Mother's shoulder. Mr. Jackson came back, holding a shoebox. He said, "These are the letters he sent." After the first 5 or so came back, marked return to sender, we stopped mailing them for him. We didn't tell him, but there just wasn't money for stamps. I apologize, Mrs. Malone. When you wrote me, your name should have rung a bell, but it didn't. There are so many people in and out of here that I didn't put two and two together. When these letters started coming back, I do remember asking him who the Malones were, and he'd never answer. "Thank you." Mother handed me the box. Mr. Jackson said, "I'm so glad something good has finally happened to one of the men, Mrs. Malone. This place is the end of the road for so many dreams." He tapped the top of the taxi cab. "Drive safe." We began to ride back to Gary. Father fell right to sleep. It was so hard to look at him. He seemed so tiny. I pulled the lid off the shoebox. It was filled with envelopes. The first one I pulled out was addressed Mrs. Margaret Malone, Master James Malone, and Miss Deza Malone. Someone had stamped on the envelope in big blue letters, "Return to sender. Addressee unknown." The next 5 envelopes were marked the same way. Every envelope afterward just had Father's handwriting, no big blue stamps and no postage stamps. I saw why none of the letters had gotten through. Father had put the wrong address on them. They all were sent to 4309 North Street, Flint, Michigan. "Mother, Father sent them to the wrong place." I showed her one of the envelopes. He was confused, Deza. "This is our old apartment in Flint, where we lived when we were first married." I put the lid back on the box. I could never read these letters. Never. They would be filled with nothing but pain. Mother laid her arm on Father's chest and cuddled him to her. He looked terrible, like all the strength and happiness had been drained out of him. "Mother, is he going to be all right? Deza, we don't know how this is going to turn out. You have to be prepared. You have to look at this clearly. We've got him back, and no one can care for him like we will. But this will be hard. He might be very different. He's coming home. I don't care." She squeezed my cheek. "I don't care either, dear." As we drove, Father would wake up every once in a while, see me or Mother and smile, then go back to sleep. We were an hour past Lansing, and Father had been awake for a while when I said, "Look, Mother, Burma shave signs. Have you ever seen these, Father?" I read to her and Father. Old Frankie Jones ran the drove really fast, known as the true football hero. Challenged a tree to 60 miles per hour. Final score, Maple 1, Frankie 0. Me, the taxi cab driver, and Mother yelled out the last sign, "Burma shave." There were two more sets of signs, and they got a smile out of Father. He fell back asleep until about 20 miles outside of Gary. His eyes came open, and he pointed his bony finger out the window and said, "Look, more signs." We were passing a field. There were no signs, only a fence and fat white and black cows. Mother pulled his hand down and said, "Why don't you try to sleep, dear?" Father pointed again. "No, don't you see them? Deza, how about you?" My heart sank. I lied. "Yes, Father, I see them." His eyes sparkled when he said, "Great. Read them with me." I looked at Mother. Her 111 lines were back. She gave me a sad smile. Before I could say anything, Father cleared his throat and started reading the signs only he could see. He had heard he had heard that hope has wings, but never believed such lofty things. It took time to set him straight, to learn hope was an open gate. Try as he might, he didn't see that hope lived in his family. He had learned that hope has wings. Father pulled his bony hand down and grabbed mine and Mother's and both of his and finished. And now he'll live by these joyous things. The car was silent as me and Mother stared at the sly smile on Father's face. He weakly waved his arms and half shouted, "Burma shave!" For the first time in a million years, Mother, Father, and me exploded in laughter together. But Father didn't get everything right. The last invisible sign really read, "Next stop, back on the road to wonderful." That is the final chapter of The Mighty Miss Malone.